information on these and other programs, visit our website at wachhouston.org. Now, to open our program and introduce our guest tonight, representing the Board of Directors of the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston, it's my pleasure to present Mr. Kevin O'Gorman. Kevin is the Office Administrative Partner at the Houston office of Norton Rose Fulbright, LLP, and he is a member of the board and the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston. Welcome, Kevin O'Gorman.
Thank you, Felicia. It's a distinct pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Ambassador Kurt Volker. Ambassador Volker is a leading expert in U.S. foreign and national security policy with over 30 years of experience in a variety of government, academic, and private sector capacities. Ambassador Volker has particular expertise in European and Eurasian affairs. He served as the U.S. Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations from 2017 to 2019. He has also served as the United States Ambassador to Nato. Overall, Ambassador Volker served for 23 years in the U.S. Foreign Service in Brussels, Budapest, London, and several positions in Washington, D.C., including on the National Security Council at the White House. Ambassador Volker served as the Executive Director of the McCain Institute for International Leadership at Arizona State University, based in Washington, D.C. Currently, he is a Senior Fellow at the Center for Transatlantic Relations at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, a Senior Advisor at the Atlantic Council, and a Trustee of the IAU College in Aix-en-Provence, France. He has taught transatlantic relations at the George Washington University School of International Affairs. In conversation today with Ambassador Volker is the World Affairs Council very own Sandia Bayot. It is now my pleasure to turn the program over to Sandia.
Welcome, everybody. So glad that you were able to join us. Ambassador, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure to be here.
May I ask you where you're joining us from?
Well, I'm in Washington, D.C., regrettably. I wish I was in Houston with you. And this event, as you know, has been long in the planning. We had several different dates to work on, and each time we ended up having to move it. And thanks to COVID-19, we're now in late October of 2020 and finally doing it by Zoom.
Absolutely. So glad that we're actually able to finally make it happen. So never give up.
Thank you. Thank you for your persistence.
For our audience, we will structure our conversation today in following parts. We'll speak about NATO, given Ambassador's experience. We'll move on to Ukraine, then perhaps touch on a little bit of the U.S. foreign policy outlook post-elections, and of course, the Q&A session with you, the audience members. Your questions, please submit through the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. Again, Q&A, and we will make sure that we get to those. Ambassador, you have had a long-standing and very distinguished career, as Kevin mentioned, in the U.S. Foreign Service and later in academic and private sectors. Much of that time was served in Europe, and most notably as U.S. Ambassador to NATO, 2008-2009. So a little bit on NATO. Even though the nature of the threat may have changed in some regards since the end of Cold War, why was NATO during your time as ambassador, and perhaps even more now, still such a vital alliance for the United States and Europe?
Well, I think the principal answer to that is the United States is founded as a nation of ideals. We believe in freedom, we believe in democracy, rule of law, market economy, protection of the rights of our citizens. And these are things that we hold dear and we are determined to protect. And what we find is that other countries in the world aspire to and realize these same things, these same values are important to them, whether it's Germany or Latvia or France or Portugal or the UK. These are countries that share those values, and they don't necessarily have the means on their own to defend themselves against all threats, but they are willing to contribute to defending a larger community against all threats. And so that's the premise of NATO, that it's all for one and one for all, as the Musketeers used to say. A threat against one, an attack against one is viewed as an attack against all. And if we make that commitment, that we agree to protect the community that shares those values, then it ends up being so formidable that nobody would dare attack that community. And we've now had 70 years of no real attacks on NATO members other than the 9/11 attacks in New York, which were a very unique case. But we've basically been able to get through this. And that is a vision of a world in which the United States is protected, and so it's in our own self-interest, and a world in which, by working with allies who share our values, we're protecting a larger segment of the world. And that creates a better ecosystem for the United States to live in. And for the principal engagement of our trade, of our tourism, of our diplomatic relationships, of our efforts to solve problems together is with our allies. And so it builds that community that is beneficial to the United States.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And overall, do you think that the increases in NATO memberships, such as nation of Latvia and others, were for the best, for increase of actually NATO?
Without question. And your question belies the fact that I spent a large portion of my career working on NATO enlargement issues. I served in Budapest, Hungary, before Hungary became a NATO member. I spent time at the National Security Council working on NATO enlargement issues, to include the 3 Baltic states, Slovakia, Slovenia, Bulgaria, Romania. I continued to work on Albania and Croatia, and I just visited Montenegro last month, one of our most recent NATO members, alongside Macedonia. And what I think is important for Americans to understand is that the people of these countries didn't have the choice in front of them. They couldn't make their own choices about what kind of country or society they wanted to live in. These were imposed on them by the Soviet Union, by the Warsaw Pact, by the communist regime in Yugoslavia. And when they had the chance to be free, they chose to build free democratic societies, market economies, and to want to get reconnected. And I say reconnected, not connected, reconnected to the rest of Europe and to the United States. By being part of the NATO alliance and also being part of the European Union in the case of Latvia or others. These are people who share our values. They want to live in free societies. They cherish democracy. They are concerned about the security threats to that. And what they most want, above all, is to make sure that their children and grandchildren don't have to go through what their generation and the previous generation went through. And by being a part of NATO, we can help them achieve that. But in addition to that, turning the lens around and looking at it from a U.S. perspective, what we gain from this is allies, friends, territory, economic relationships, beneficial geography, even from a military perspective, where we now have a base, for instance, in Poland, and we have some troops deployed in the Baltic states. We have bases on the ports in the Black Sea, thanks to Romania and Bulgaria. These are things that we wouldn't have otherwise, that enable the U.S. to extend its reach of providing security and stability in a wider area, meaning that the threats to the United States are more constrained and further away. And so it's a mutually beneficial arrangement. And I think if we think about the 20th century and all the things that went wrong, World War I, the Depression, World War II, the Cold War, the most important thing we got right was helping 100 million people in Central and Eastern Europe provide security for their own future.
I agree. And having actually worked at the Embassy of Latvia at the time that we were joining NATO and joining EU, was a really interesting time to be in Washington. And I say for some of the younger nations, as we were, and many others that were joining, I think it was actually most helpful to have requirements or points that we had to reach. So we need to put our house in order. And this was really good plan for us and many other nations, right? To put your economy in order, your judicial system in order. And this was really a great way for us to go through the checklist, and that was the ultimate reward. So it was really a wonderful experience.
Yeah.
For years, we hear that many individuals here in the US, some European countries, of course, have complained that some NATO members are not contributing effectively or spending enough on defense. We still hear that.
Yeah.
Is this fair assessment, and you think has gotten better or worse in the last few years?
Well, yes, it is a fair assessment. And yes, it has gotten better, but it is not as good as it should be. And to put this in some context, President Trump has gotten a lot of criticism for the way he talks about NATO and the way he complains about allies not doing their fair share. But I want to remind the audience here that every president that I worked for, starting with Ronald Reagan, did the same thing. That they complained that allies should pay a higher proportion of GDP for defense. In the case of Ronald Reagan, it was 3% of GDP, also during the time of Clinton. Then in 2000, the Bush administration decided just to lower the standard and say, let's say 2%. It's more achievable for countries to say 2% than 3%. So we just arbitrarily made that the target. And then countries didn't even make 2% under the Bush administration. President Obama did the same thing. Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, who served in Texas, as you know, Texas A&M, but also was Secretary of Defense under Bush and Obama, complained that during his tenure as Secretary of Defense, the share that the U.S. spent of total NATO country defense spending rose from 50 to 75%. And he complained in 2014, I believe it was, this is politically unsustainable. This cannot continue. And in 2014, the NATO allies agreed on the 2% target for defense spending yet again. And since 2014, a large number of NATO countries in those 6 years have still not committed 2% to defense, 2% of GDP on defense spending. And I understand that these are difficult choices when you have domestic political pressures and economic pressures and unemployment and healthcare and all of that. But I think it is quite fair for American citizens to ask, why should we pay for your defense when you won't pay for it yourself? Mm-hmm. And that, I think, is a fundamental political problem for NATO that can only be addressed by NATO countries spending more on defense themselves. In the past few years, there has been substantial progress. More countries have hit the 2% mark. And I believe the number is $400 billion additional defense spending from European NATO allies by 2020 compared to 2017. So that is significant improvement. No one can shake a stick at that. But at the same time, big countries like Germany, like France, like Italy, they can do more and they should do more.
Thank you. I see already questions coming in that are triggered by our NATO conversation. Of course, others circling back, and I promise we will get to those. Okay. We will make our journey into Ukraine and that part of the world. As stated earlier, from 2017 to 2019, you served again as a high-level diplomat as the United States Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations. What were your roles in that position, and what were your expectations?
Right. Well, I think I took a position of U.S. Special Representative in 2017. Which was 3 years after the events of the Maidan, 2014, when there was a major change in government in Ukraine. By the time I took office, a lot of things had happened, and that kind of clarified the situation. The president of Ukraine in 2014, Yanukovych, killed 100 people, fled the country. There was a replacement of him by the parliament and then a democratic election. And then a new government trying to do what it could under those circumstances. Russia invaded Ukraine. It occupied and then claimed to annex the Crimean Peninsula. It invaded eastern Ukraine and created these puppet states in Luhansk and Donetsk. And then there was something of a stagnation of a low-level conflict. And that's the point at which I came in. So there, the goals that I had, and I discussed them in advance with Secretary of State Tillerson and Secretary of Defense Mattis, that I will be happy to play this role as a U.S. envoy, but I want to be clear what our goals are. The goal is the restoration of Ukraine's territory and the sovereignty and security and respect for the rights of all Ukrainians, whether they're ethnic Ukrainian or Russian speaking or Tatar or whatever. that we want to see rights respected inside Ukraine, but the territory restored to Ukraine. So we agreed on those goals. Obviously, if you follow these things, you know that Russia had the opposite goals. Russia wanted to reverse the 2014 change in power, reimpose a government or reinstall a government that was going to be more favorable to Russia. And it was using the annexation of territory and the stimulation of a war that Russia controlled in order to bring instability and insecurity to Ukraine, to try to put enough pressure on the government to get it to crack. So we were at once supporting the government of Ukraine, pushing the government of Ukraine to make necessary reforms to strengthen themselves, and pushing back on Russia, hoping that we could get to a point where Russia found it in its own interest to negotiate a resolution. But until we got to that point, very happy to try to support Ukraine as much as possible so that they could defend themselves. And that was the role that I took on. And I think actually we were as successful as you could be for that couple of year period.
You touched upon the revolution of 2014. Were you, say, surprised that it was so successful and actually toppled the government?
I was surprised that the government used lethal force to the extent it did. As I said, they killed 100 people, young people, protesters on the Maidan. You know, they go out there, they sing songs, they drink, they wave banners and flags, and that can go on for a long time and then it can die out. But the moment that the security forces of the country kill their own people, it brings everybody else out into the streets against the government. And it was in that moment that the president of the country literally fled the country. He took a car to his dacha, which was extraordinarily luxurious. He had his own zoo, and he took a helicopter from there to the Russian border and escaped into Russia. And this was a moment of collapse of that corrupt system that he had created. I don't think anyone knew for sure that the protests would result in the toppling of the government or not. And I don't even think they would have used the words topple the government. What they wanted was the president to reverse course and to reopen negotiations with the European Union about eventual membership, to keep the dialogue going with Europe and the United States. And it was his decision to abandon all that that brought the people out to protest to begin with. So when he fled the country, I think people were genuinely surprised, not just in our country, but even in Ukraine. And then when he did flee the country, it was a bit of a scramble to figure out, well, what is the way that we restore democratic institutions as fairly and quickly as possible? And that's what happened to follow on.
Sure. Can you comment kind of what were the actual roles and actions that U.S. did or perhaps did not take during this revolution, the unknown time?
Yeah, this is an important question because Russia often trots out a narrative that this was a U.S.-inspired coup, that we toppled the government of Ukraine, which is completely false. This was completely a domestic uprising against a president who the people felt was acting against the country's own interests, and they came out to the streets to protest. What the U.S. did do was provide rhetorical support and moral support to the demonstrators and call upon Yanukovych to reverse those decisions that he made that had called people out into the streets. And those decisions, to be clear, are walking away from an association agreement with the European Union. That shouldn't be so terribly controversial. And the reason he did it was that Russia wanted to make sure Ukraine did not get closer to Europe. So I think the U.S. played a role of moral and political support, but not any kind of active support. This was something that the Ukrainian people really did themselves.
And we'll touch upon this neighbor a little bit later, but I think there are similar thoughts that are floating in the virtual world and other of one of the neighboring countries of Ukraine, currently. And what are your impressions since 2014, the effectiveness of the governments that have come post 2014?
Yeah. So Ukraine, as some of your audience may know, came out of the Soviet Union in 1991 with a GDP that was roughly the same as Poland, and a population that was slightly larger. And today, that GDP is about a third the size of Poland. And it has the second lowest GDP per capita in Europe. So there's no other way to look at these numbers than to say that something went wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And what went wrong was privatization that ended up concentrating economic power in the hands of a very few people, who then were able to control or corrupt the government, the parliament, the courts, the media, business transactions, to create such a corrosive environment that it deterred foreign investment rather than welcomed foreign investment. And this happened over years and successive presidents and successive regimes in Ukraine. It was not just one person or one person's fault. This was a systemic challenge for the country. President Yanukovych, the one who fled the country that I talked about, was probably the culmination of that corruption of the system. And when he left, there was great hope in 2014 that finally there would be an opportunity for change. And there was a new team that came into power, but it was very, very difficult for them to uproot the economic, media, and political powers that had embedded themselves in the country for what, the preceding 15 years or 12 years. So it was very, very difficult. They made more progress between 2014 and 2018 in reforming the country and fighting corruption and strengthening democratic institutions than had ever been made in independent Ukraine prior to that. And at the same time, it was woefully inadequate. And so in 2018, the incumbent president, Poroshenko, was soundly defeated in an election by a newcomer who had never been in politics before, President Zelensky. He had been a comedian with a television show, because he promised that he would change the system wholesale. And people desperately believed in that vision that Ukraine could be a normal country like other normal countries, could clean out corruption, could grow economically, connect itself to the wider world, Europe and the transatlantic community. In the 2 years that President Zelensky has been in power, it is sad to say, but I fear it's true to say, that the results have been increasingly disappointing. His first 6 months to a year was dramatic. It was exciting. He was promising and trying to do things in all areas that Ukraine needed to do, and he did get a lot of reforms implemented. But the longer it's gone on, the more his popularity has gone down, the more various oligarchs who hold economic and media and other power have been able to reassert themselves. One in particular, a guy named Kolomoisky, have reasserted power in the country in many different ways. A informal system of offline payments to members of parliament has been reinstated. The parliamentary majority that he won in the parliamentary elections in the summer of 2019 has evaporated because parliamentarians have been bought off. They just had local elections this past weekend in which his party, the Servant of the People Party, did dramatically worse than it did a year ago. And the pro-Russian opposition did a little bit better. Other parties did better. Local power brokers did better. So it's been a reversion to norm under the past year to year and a half in Ukraine compared to what anyone would have wanted or expected. It doesn't mean that Ukraine is a hopeless case. It doesn't mean that things can't be fixed. It doesn't mean that things are worse than they were before. The trajectory from a tough place to a better place is never going to be a straight line. But Ukraine has gone through a pretty rough time. COVID-19 has made it worse because the economy has taken a hit and things have contracted. The lack of progress on the conflict that Russia has imposed in the East, that's also been a factor. People are tired of the war, but they can't get Russia to stop. I'd say, drift in attention from the United States and from Western Europe has also not helped. I think Ukraine needs active engagement and active support to help them in their ability to deal with some of their internal and external challenges.
So road ahead, that's for sure. It's a lot of cultures has to change and individuals. It is not an instant. It's not an instant change, that's for sure. They need to be willing and ready to accept it before they will actually action on it.
There's something, Sandhya, you may be thinking about yourself, given your background. There's a difference between countries like Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovakia, that were under the Warsaw Pact, but it was really only from 1946 onward. So you're talking 1.5, 2 generations before they got their freedom back. And they had a muscle memory of what it's like to be a democracy. Latvia is in that category as well. Other countries like Ukraine or Georgia, their muscle memory goes back to 1920. So they lost a few generations, and with a much higher degree of Sovietization. And changing the mentality and reintroducing democratic institutions to those countries has proven to be a lot more difficult. I'd argue in large measure because of the amount of time that the Soviets had to shape the mentality there.
True. We have to touch upon, of course, of Crimea, with the Russian annexation of Crimea and the involvement in the civil war, Eastern Ukraine. Do you feel that Obama administration was correct to largely only impose economic sanctions and not to do something more or differently?
Well, I don't want to blame the Obama administration because nobody expected that what happened is what would happen. You know, no one thought Russia would really take it over. No one thought Russia would really annex, the territory, and they did it very quickly, in a space of about 6 weeks. So I want to be fair and say they were taken by surprise.
I think most of us were.
Yeah, most of us were, and it's fair. That being said, what should have happened is an immediate sanction rather than a sanction after the fact. That is, as soon as they started to take over physical control of Crimea, there should have been a sanction. Second, when we provided assistance to Ukraine, we should never have denied them the weapons necessary to defend themselves. We should have immediately said, no, this is a country under attack. It has a right to self-defense under the UN Charter. And the sooner that we can help them defend themselves, the quicker this conflict will stabilize. When Russia feels that it's just a wide open green field, they're going to advance. And that's exactly what they did. And they opened a second front in eastern Ukraine shortly thereafter. There should have been an immediate non-recognition policy on Russia's claimed annexation of Crimea. I worked hard at that when I was special representative, and we got that done in, I believe it was July of 2018, the Pompeo Declaration. That was critically important to put on the record that we will never accept this. Just like we never accepted the Soviet occupation of the Baltic states, we were not going to accept Russia's takeover of Crimea. There is no basis for that. We also should have done a lot more diplomatically to rally support for Ukraine in the face of Russia's seizure of Crimea. Instead, I am told by my Ukrainian friends that at the time the US government was counseling them not to fight back, not to escalate the crisis, which Russia took as a green light. And I'm very sorry to see that, because then I think it led to the conflict in eastern Ukraine as well. All that being said, I think it was a difficult time for the Obama administration, not knowing quite what to do. Ukraine's not the only issue on the table. There are other issues like Syria that we're worried about at the same time. But at the end of the day, Ukraine is basically is now in a very long-term standoff with Russia about regaining sovereignty over Crimea, and in a ongoing low-level war with Russia over eastern Ukraine, which has displaced over 1.5 million people, killed over 13,000 people, and it's still going on every day.
Yeah, I have a question coming in actually from Kevin. Since we're in Russia-Ukraine conversation, it's kind of specific. What was the Russian role, if any, in downing the Flight of 17 over eastern Ukraine?
Well, I think the Dutch investigation into that is public. It's available online for anyone who wants to look into it. The system that actually shot down the plane has been identified by number. It was part of the Russian inventory. It was moved into eastern Ukraine. It was fired from eastern Ukraine. There's a minor debating point of whether the person pulling the trigger, if you will, was active duty Russian military or a Russian soldier on vacation or a local ethnic Russian working for a militia funded by Russia who was being advised by Russians from the Russian military who actually did it. It really doesn't matter because the only way this equipment got in there and the way the decision was made to fire was because of Russia's intervention in eastern Ukraine.
Thank you. Leon also has a question while we on kind of Ukraine, Russia, NATO, before we jump to the next subject. Leon asks us, Ambassador, do you believe that U.S. would militarily defend the Baltic states from indirect Russian aggression as is currently underway in eastern Ukraine? Yeah. Next question, before January 21.
Yes, I do believe that the U.S. would come to the defense of the Baltic states if they were attacked, as we would any other NATO member. There is so much instinctive commitment to the NATO Article 5 defense commitment in our system, not just the administration, but also the Congress, also the military, also the intelligence community, also the public, also the think tanks, all the experts. We have a 70-year track record of people who have served in administration after administration, who have led our national security policy, who understand this. And there's no question in my mind that we would come to the defense of the Baltic states. The interesting part of the question, however, was the word indirect, because what we, I think, increasingly find is that threats are not simply military and geographic. Threats can be technological, they can be cyber, they can be electronic, they can be intelligence, they can be disruption, they can be information, and they can't necessarily be pinned down to coming from a particular geography. It could come from Russia, it could come from China, it could come from Iran, it could come from a place that we can't identify. And in those circumstances where NATO is poorly tuned to be able to respond to a non-military threat or to know what the threat is coming from, that's when you run into hesitation in decision-making. What do we do? Thanks to French President Macron, who, reflecting on this, said NATO was brain dead, NATO has embarked on a so-called reflection process or a reflection group. They've appointed a number of senior people from around the alliance to think about just these questions. What is NATO not getting right? How do we have to adapt the alliance to the world that we live in today? I've had a chance to brief the group. A friend of mine is co-chairing it, Wes Mitchell. It's a serious effort to really think through these questions. Decision-making is always difficult, no matter how serious the analysis. So I can't predict how far NATO will go, but it is trying to think through how to answer these questions about the nature of the threat and the geography of the threat that NATO has not fully grappled with till now.
And on a similar note, as of NATO now, today, Stephen asks us, what do we do about NATO allies that are becoming increasingly authoritarian, i.e. Hungary, Turkey, Poland?
Yep.
Can we trust them to be reliable, or a Russian wolf in the sheep's clothing?
Yeah, it's a great question. And you will find people to give you very different perspectives on this. And I respect all of those different opinions. But my opinion is that the first question we have to ask ourselves is, do we want them on our side or on Russia's side? And if we want them on our side, then we've got to learn how to talk with them and work with them and try to engage them. I think we made a mistake in the case of Hungary and in the case of Turkey and in the case, lesser degree, Poland, but also with Poland, of ostracizing them and saying that, oh, we don't like some of the choices that you are making about laws that you're passing, about the way you are handling democracy in your own countries, or in the case of Turkey, it's much more repressive. In Hungary and Poland, it's really more about conservative versus liberal policies. but in Turkey is a bit more repressive. But even in the case of Turkey, I think that we should focus on NATO being a commitment to collective defense. We share a mutual interest in this, and we share common strategic interests in the neighborhood. Put yourself for a moment in the geography of Turkey. To the north, you have Russia, which is fighting a war against Ukraine and fighting a war against Georgia, which is a neighbor. To the east, you have Iraq, which is a divided country where you have a Kurdish region that you get along with, but a Shia-dominated government in Baghdad that can be tricky. You have Iran further to the east, which is a threat. You have Syria, where Bashar Assad is killing his own people with Iranian support. You have Syrian Kurds, who are allied with terrorist groups inside Turkey. And then you have the Eastern Mediterranean, where you have Lebanon, you have Israel, you have Egypt, which right now has a government that is very hostile to the government in Turkey, and you have a civil war going on in Libya. So Turkey is in the middle of all this and has interests in all of this. Mostly it needs to protect itself, and it wants stability around itself. To some degree, the US shares these interests of stability and security in the region. And to some degree, we disagree with the Turkish perspective on this. But the way we can come to something sustainable is to then sit down and have a strategic dialogue with Turkey about what will work in the long term for you and for us, what will not work in the long term for you and for us, and see if we can come to some common ground. And the final point I'd say on this is that both the Obama administration and the Trump administration have placed an importance on the withdrawal of US forces from Iraq and Syria. And I don't see any way we can withdraw our forces from those countries and leave peace behind without Turkey playing a security role in the region, which means we'd better figure out a way to come up with a strategic alignment with Turkey on these things, if at all we can. I will be the first one to admit that Erdogan makes this really, really hard. He's very difficult to deal with. He is, in my view, overdoing a pursuit of Turkish interests at the expense of others. But nonetheless, if we don't approach it from the perspective that I started with, we end up ostracizing NATO members, weakening the alliance, and putting a higher demand on our own forces and our own commitment to compensate for the lack of cohesion in the alliance.
Sure. And we'll come back to more again. Thank you, audience, for your submitting the questions. And I promise you I'm reading them. So just trying to weave in a conversation as we go. We also know that you testified last year, late last year, on the Hill, and knowing that the role of Russian influence in the US politics was already a major issue of contention. Were you surprised that Ukraine became such a political issue?
Well, I was, in a way, to be honest. I know that Russia had been the big issue, as the questioner suggests. Ukraine is one where there is a very high degree of bipartisan consensus in the United States. We oppose Russia's aggression, oppose Russia's claimed annexation of Crimea. We support assistance for Ukraine. We support defensive assistance for Ukraine. So there's a great degree of bipartisan support. And I didn't expect that Ukraine would then be chosen to be the vehicle in which to pursue an impeachment proceeding against the president. Now, the president's phone call with the president of Ukraine, Zelensky, July 25th of 2019, in which he asked to say, can you do me a favor, as everyone knows from all the testimony. That was a surprise. Of course, the White House released the transcript of that on September 27th. That was a surprise that it was that direct from the president to ask for the government of Ukraine to look into the company, Burisma. But the fact that it happened, it's there and it's unseemly. And as I testified, I found that inappropriate. But as the House and Senate found, while the House voted to impeach the president, the offenses that were used to charge the president were not impeachable offenses, and that's what the Senate found in the trial. And as a result, what we saw was a huge turmoil in our country, in domestic politics, from late September of 2019 until early 2020. We saw a complete disruption of our policy dealing with Ukraine, and to some degree Russia, but principally Ukraine. which has still gone on. 1 year on, we do not have an ambassador in Ukraine. We do not have a special envoy to replace me. We do not have very much active, visible U.S. support for Ukraine. And that support has been critical for both helping the Ukrainian government justify reforms and for helping the Ukrainian government work with Germany and France to present a united front against Russia. So Ukraine has suffered tremendously from this. And I think our foreign policy has suffered from this.
Sure. So would you say that this might be a good example, if I can say good, of why domestic politics should not be, to influence U.S. foreign policy?
Yes and no. There's no country, including the United States, in which you can divorce foreign policy from domestic politics. Every country will want to say what's in our interest and how do we pursue that interest. However, this was a purely partisan argument between the Democrats and the Republicans over how the president conducted himself. And it wasn't about Ukraine. I always would tell my Ukrainian interlocutors and also media commentary afterwards that Ukraine occurs in US speech in two completely different contexts. One of them is Ukraine, which is actually a real place. It's a country with a geography. It's got 40 million people. They have aspirations, they have problems, and the US has an interest in their success. And the other use of Ukraine is as a prop in an argument about whether the president behaved badly or didn't behave badly. And both sides will make that argument. Ukraine occurs in both contexts, but it's important for our Ukrainian interlocutors and also I think for the US public to understand that when we're using Ukraine in the second context, it has nothing actually to do with Ukraine as the country or US interests with respect to that country.
Sure. Do you think eventually Ukraine should be offered membership into NATO? I realize there's still ways to go.
Yeah, well, that's the point. I firmly believe that we will never have long-term peace and prosperity and democracy across all of Europe and Eurasia, including Russia, until everybody is part of that family. So it's the people of Ukraine really aspire to that. And I think if they are successful, others can be successful as well. I think we have to hope that the people of Russia one day finally get a chance to run their own country as well and to have a democracy and prosperity and the rule of law, something they've never had. I hope that all of that is achievable. And I don't think will ever be done until that can happen. Ukraine, as you said, however, is not there today.
Yeah.
And I can name any number of ways in which people assessing Ukraine's preparedness for NATO membership would find it falling short as compared with the Baltic states or Hungary or Poland at the time that they joined NATO, whether in democratic institutions or the economy, fighting corruption, civil control of the military, contribution to security of the alliance as a whole, corruption especially, and an investment climate and a business climate that is open and welcoming and integrated with the rest of Europe. Ukraine has a really long way to go. I think a more timely case that we should be talking about is Georgia. Georgia has an election this coming Saturday. It is likely to be among the freest and fairest elections the country has had. They've had peaceful changes of power. They've had presidential and parliamentary elections in succession. They have a fairly well-established institutional democracy. They have very high rankings from World Bank on Transparency International and ease of doing business. They are culturally a European country and historically connected to Europe. They had a democracy back in 1920 where women were in the parliament. So this is a country that, and it has been the second largest troop contributor in Afghanistan. So it's a country that has really contributed in many, many ways. Their problem is that Russia occupies 20% of their territory. And many of our European allies feel that they don't want to take Georgia into NATO and then all of a sudden have another NATO boundary with Russia occupying part of that territory. My own view on that is that this incentivizes Russia to occupy other countries' territories because it keeps them out of NATO. And I think we need to find a formula where we and Georgia would agree that there would be no use of force to retake the territories. We only seek their peaceful reintegration into Georgia, but that should not hold the rest of the country back. And I think in every other respect, Georgia is much more prepared for NATO membership today than Ukraine is.
Sure. Going back to Ukrainian neighborhood, Belarus, we see a lot of things trending similar as Ukraine started, probably same players in the theater and same finger pointing as have happened historically. Your understanding of Ukraine, Russia, what are your thoughts on the current situation? And I know this could be, our conversation just on that subject.
Well, yes, and it's very sad. In Belarus, we are in a situation now where the best we can do is hope for time. Russia has already engaged in a hybrid takeover of the power structures in Belarus. It has taken over the media. It has taken over the security services. It has exercised decisive influence on the military. It has parked Russian military forces next to Belarus. It has engaged in large-scale military exercises. Russia would be perfectly fine if Lukashenko stayed in power, provided he cracked down on the demonstrators and did not give up power. What Russia desperately does not want is power to change hands through democratic means or through protests. They also would prefer to accomplish this without the direct involvement of Russian military forces, but they will use them if necessary. As long as they can accomplish this, they're fine. And as I said, Russia has all the levers there. It's also interesting that the people of Belarus are not asking to join the EU or NATO as the people of Ukraine were. The people of Belarus are just asking to be able to change their own government after 26 years of one person in power. That, I think, is a reasonable demand. And that's where I think the US and Western Europe can reliably stake our position, is that we support the aspirations of the people of Belarus to change their government as a matter of democratic process, according to the Belarusian constitution. This is not a contest between NATO and Russia or the US and Russia. It's about the Belarusian people being able to choose their own leader. And I think if we stick to that, we create space for the Belarusian people to try again, to have another election some point, to try to get to that point where they're choosing their own government. We're not going to see Lukashenko pushed out of power. But if these demonstrations continue, and if we are also willing to sustain our support for the people of Belarus, that's probably the best outcome we can get. Thank
you. McCain Institute has been part of your life for many somewhat recent years. You spent 7 years there as executive director. Just your thoughts of how would you define Senator McCain's legacy? Right.
Well, I had the privilege of knowing Senator McCain and working with him beginning in the mid-90s. So I knew him for just about 20 years. And I know that, some people love Senator McCain, some people, criticize him, but I have to tell you, he was a remarkable human being. I have tremendous respect for everything that he did. You can't understand him without understanding his time as a prisoner of war. He spent 5 years in a Vietnamese prison cell, tortured, beat up, deprived, and did not give up, did not jump ahead of his colleagues who were to be released before him, even though they beat him more because of it. He maintained his honor and his dignity. And coming out of that, he was never afraid of anything or anybody. He had been through the worst already. And so he was prepared to do whatever he thought and be whoever he thought he should be. And what I've really seen in the years that I worked at the McCain Institute, and even in the last year after his passing, is that people around the world felt like he knew them, that he respected them, and even though he might push them or disagree with them, he was someone that they could engage with, and they thought there was somebody in the United States who believed in them. That's a tremendous accomplishment to have that kind of global impact. I see it in Georgia. We with the McCain Institute, did an annual conference in Georgia for 5 years. I know it in Latvia, I know it in Lithuania, Estonia, Hungary. I was just in Turkey, I was just in Montenegro. Montenegro couldn't conceive of being an independent country without the support from John McCain. So he left a tremendous legacy. I think about the Senate today, and there are some very good people in the Senate. There's a younger generation of people with international experience who are committed to core values. They have not yet grown to the stature that Senator McCain or others of his generation had achieved, but they generally are good people, internationally minded, values driven, many of them veterans. And I have a lot of hope for where we come out in the future, but passing of John McCain was a tremendous loss.
Sure, agreed. Question from Jim, a little bit back to NATO. Is there a process of a nation to be removed from NATO?
We've been through a few experiences. We had a coup in Greece where colonels took over. We had military regime in Turkey. We had a dictatorship in Portugal. And in all of these cases, countries were not kicked out of NATO. There's no mechanism for NATO to take decisions other than by consensus. That's probably a good thing. I wouldn't change it. And what we did do was find ways to restrict participation and access for countries where we didn't trust the governments. We didn't trust their protection of security materials. We didn't trust that they wouldn't use information or exercises or material against another NATO member. So we found ways to restrict participation, but not to kick countries out of NATO. And in every case, those countries changed and came back into the fold of NATO as democracies, as part of a security community. I think that's the right thing to do. And as I said earlier in talking about the questions that have come up with respect to Hungary and Poland, I think we are far better off engaging them and having a dialogue that puts us on the same side of the table. Too often we are acting as though we're on opposite sides of the table. Like we, the United States, are a democracy, and you, Hungary, are screwing up democracy. You're clamping down on freedom of the press. You're changing the constitution. You're restricting the rights of the opposition. So you're anti-democratic and we're pro-democratic. And what result does that have? It alienates them in their relationship with us or with the European Union, and it gives them no reason not to take business deals with Russia or China for energy or for infrastructure. I think that's the wrong way to think about it, because we all are facing challenges, whether it's the United States or the UK or France or Germany or Italy, with political movements that are outside the mainstream, populist, nationalist, sometimes conservative, sometimes far left. They are legitimate movements. They respect the aspirations of people. They are therefore democratic. And they're having a hard time figuring out, how do we deal with a perception of elites who have been out of touch and public aspirations that have not been realized, and trying to figure out how to reconnect those. Rather than seeing ourselves as on the right side of this and countries like Hungary on the wrong side, I think we should see ourselves on the same side, saying these are challenges that our democratic societies face. We are handling them as best we can. We have different experiences. We ought to talk about it, and we ought to stick together.
Thank you. And we have all but 5 minutes left, and we haven't touched upon the subject of the future. And we know this thing coming around the corner called the U.S. elections that I'm sure none of us is hearing anything about. Can we look a little bit in the future? Maybe paths are they aligned? Are they going in different directions?
Yeah, well, I'm not going to predict the election outcome. Maybe you'd like to tell me how Texas is going to vote, but
it's all up for grabs, you know.
But what I would say is that I believe it's incontrovertible that between President Trump and Vice President Biden, you have two very distinct personalities, distinct tone, how they communicate and what they communicate with others and with allies and with adversaries and so on. The tone is very, very different. I would argue, however, that the substance of policy for the United States, whether under second term Bush, Obama, or President Trump, has been very consistent. And likewise, if I look ahead to either a second-term President Trump or a first-term President Biden, I don't see much change in US policy. And let's go through this. Let's look at the Middle East. I don't see the US moving the US embassy back to Tel Aviv. I don't see us undoing the peace agreements between Israel and Bahrain or Israel and the United Arab Emirates. I don't see us going elsewhere. I don't see us easing up the sanctions on Russia that the Trump administration and the Congress have put in place. I don't see us reversing the support for Ukraine's ability to defend itself. I don't see us slackening our support for NATO, nor do I see us slackening our demand that NATO allies pay 2% of GDP. I don't see us reversing the deployment of US forces to Poland. I don't see us slackening in our growing pushback on China, whether it's on trade or on security or on neighbors or on human rights. I don't see us giving up on our desire to build a better relationship with India. I don't see us switching our support for Guaido in Venezuela in favor of Maduro. And I can go on and on and on. I don't really see a lot of change in US policy. I just see a change in tone. The one area that I would single out where I think we have made mistakes lately and where I would hope President Trump, if he's reelected, or President Biden, if he's elected, would introduce some course correction. It is in the US relationship with Germany and the US relationship with the European Union. We are coming out of the COVID crisis with authoritarians on the march. We will have massive debts, they will not. They are acting aggressively, we are looking inward. We are creating a vacuum that others are very happy to fill. And if we want to be successful in the world as a country, we need those of us who believe in our shared values to be working together. And I think the most important relationship there is the US and Germany. Germany is critical to getting Europe on board, whether it is dealing with Russia, dealing with Syria, dealing with Turkey, dealing with trade, dealing with China. We need that. And Germany's key to getting the European Union on board, which is still the biggest economic relationship the United States has between the US and Europe, despite everything everybody says about China. So I hope that is an area of course correction in the future.
I think this summed up so nicely and how well you covered the better understanding of us of Ukraine, your role in NATO, understanding NATO as an organization, understanding the past and looking slightly in the future as much as we can. Understanding how US foreign policy also looks for years to come. So it's been fantastic to have you finally join us. Thank you for your time. I do also know that there's more to talk, so which also I'm going to say, let's put a placemaker so we can continue a dialogue when it's post-COVID, when situation turns, and certainly continue this exciting dialogue.
Well, thank you so much. It's been my pleasure to be here. It's been a fun conversation. And the only regret I have is that we're doing it virtually rather than in person. And I hope next time we manage to do this in Houston.
Absolutely. I wish you good health. I wish all our members good health. Be healthy, be warm. I even brought my turtleneck out because it got cold today in Houston. So wonderful to have you join us. Again, thank you for everybody's time. And we'll look forward to seeing you at some of the upcoming sessions, as Felicia mentioned. Thank you. And this concludes our session for this evening. Thank you, Ambassador, and bye-bye, Washington, D.C.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.